I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sabrina Little. She is a philosophy professor in the Chase Center at Ohio State University. Her areas of research are virtue theory, character education, and moral psychology. Sabrina is also a 5-time U.S. national champion and world silver medalist in trail and ultramarathon running. She previously held American records in both the 24-hour run and the 200-kilometer run. She is a mom of 3 and the author of The Examined Run: Why Good People Make Better Runners with Oxford University Press. You can and should check out that book out in the narthex, along with so many other wonderful ones. I'll add that people have been asking about moral formation in sports since probably the beginning of sports. But from my perspective, as someone who also does research in virtue in sport, Sabrina has really catalyzed a renewed interest in these questions with this book in a way that I am noticing people nationwide being really excited about. And I think it's the way that she describes how repeated practices in sport can both form and deform us. And she does a really good job of integrating moral psychology with philosophy. And then lastly, I'll just say, on a personal note, I admire Sabrina very, very much as a person who is doing scholarship at the highest level while also mothering young children. So I know that we are all going to be very challenged and intrigued by what Sabrina has to share. So will you all please join me in welcoming her?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I love being back at Baylor. I got my PhD here in philosophy, and one of my favorite things about Baylor is just the people. It's just so many fruitful conversations with people who are excited about the work they're doing. And so, yeah, it's fun to be here back in this environment, and it's been fun to meet all of you and hear about your kinds of projects internationally and things. So I'm a philosopher. Philosophers ask a lot of questions. So I'm going to start by asking you a couple questions, and I need you to call out to help me out here. So first of all, what are your sports backgrounds? Sports that you've played, sports that you've coached? Basketball, volleyball. Nice. Okay, I haven't heard any running. Is there any running? Okay, great. Okay, awesome. What are ways that sports have formed you in good ways? Formed resilience. What else? Work ethic. Good. What else? What was that? Yeah, endurance. What was that? Good. Yeah. What else? Teamwork. Yeah. A lot of socialization happens in the context of sports. Okay. And then what about for ill? How has sports formed you in destructive ways? What's that? Injury, yeah, good. What else? Anger, yeah, good. Sometimes reinforced in play. What else? Good. Yep, a lot of envy. Yeah, good. Yeah, I ask about the negative formative potential of sports. I mean, nobody wants to talk about that, right? But I think sometimes we take for granted that we're being formed in positive ways in sports. I mean, if you ask parents why they sign their children up for Little League, they're not going to say, oh, it's the envy for me, right? They're probably going to say something about discipline, learning how to manage your desires and things like that, right? But sports is not necessarily going to form you well, right? If you set out every day in your training and your training is imprudent, right? Your desires are intemperate, your inclinations are uncourageous, or your motivations are awry, you're probably forming yourself in ways that are going to have a negative impact on the rest of your life, right? They're going to translate into the rest of your life. So today I'm going to talk about the formative potential for constructive forms of change that can happen in sport, but I do want you to know that oftentimes this formative potential of sport is unmet, right? Good character is not something that's formed by accident, and often we fail to use sports intentionally toward good ends. Or worse, sometimes we use it and are formed in bad ways. So here's the plan for my talk. I'm going to talk about the formative value of sport for moral and spiritual development. Then I'll describe how we can use sports in a way that detracts from your formation. I'll talk about practical ways we can use sports for virtue, and then I'll conclude with ways in which this can go awry, so common errors that are made. So let's go. My sport is distance running. I've competed in all levels of the sport, so youth sport, high school, college, elite and professional. Now I'm a mom trying to navigate where running fits in and trying to figure out, can I still be elite within the constraints that I have, something that I'm actively working through. I also coached middle school and high school cross country and track, actually just down the road at Live Oak Classical School, and that was prior to and during my time at Baylor. Live Oak Classical, if you get the chance to visit sometime, you really should. It's a wonderful school. I love running. It's been a wonderful blessing in my life. It's allowed me to travel. It's introduced me to my best friends, and it's been a critical part of my education alongside formal learning, right? If your education is turning of your affections, if it's forming you in certain ways, then running has certainly played a significant role in that, right? And if there's one thing that my family and my friends know about me, it's that I love to run, right? There are many signs that I do. Running's the first thing I do in the morning, often in the afternoon. I never miss a day. I think about running a lot, my own and other people's. I'm a fan of the sport. I have an excellent watch tan thanks to my running. And I'm the kind of person who worries about the weight of my sunglasses as though 1 to 2 grams could impact my pacing per mile. The point is, I love to run. My life is a testimony to that love. My life is saturated with sport in a way that's visible to other people. My sport directs my attention. It dictates how I spend my time. But running's not the only thing that I love. It's not my highest love either. I'm a Christian. So naturally, I wonder whether my life testifies to that great love to the extent that it testifies to my love of sport. Is that love also visible to my friends? Is my relationship with Christ non-negotiable in the way that my training is? Does my love of God occupy my attention and order my days? These are important questions for Christian athletes. Many of us love our sports, and if there's one thing sports can show us, it's what it looks like to build your life around some great love. Sports turn your attention, they capture your affections. For many of us, it would be unthinkable to miss the big game, right? Or to forego our training. But when it comes to spiritual formation, we sometimes lack that same intentional action and attention. We micromanage our training down to the second, and then we throw up our hands as though there's nothing we can do, and we hope it works out concerning spiritual goods. Also, sometimes our love of sport can compete with love of Christ. So these are cautions I want to begin with. I'm going to discuss how sport can be used constructively for moral and spiritual formation. And we can take cues from sport about what it looks like to have our lives testify to a great love so that others can see, right, bearing that kind of fruit. But many of us should be careful that the love of sports does not compete with or undermine our relationships with Christ. Okay, what is a virtue? I need you to call out again. Tell me, what does virtue mean? Good, excellent. Yeah. Anything else that it calls to mind? If someone says you're a virtuous person, what does that mean? Good, yeah. Yeah, actions align with belief. Yeah, in the classical tradition, it's actions, your affections, and your thoughts, right? That kind of alignment. Can you name any examples of virtues? Patience, love. I heard fortitude. Courage, good. Yeah, awesome. Okay. So yes, these are words we are most familiar with in terms of just the words that we use to praise other people, right? So virtue, arete, it means excellence, as we heard, right? These are dispositional traits that incline us to think, act, and feel in fitting ways. So for example, the kind person, what does that mean? Well, the kind person is inclined to perform kind acts, think kind thoughts, and feel kindly toward others. The honest person is inclined to desire the truth, think about what's true, and then speak the truth. Virtues make us good instances of our kind as humans, and they help us to flourish. So an example of this is, think about perseverance. What is perseverance? It's to remain in place towards some good end. It basically means to stay, right? To stay committed to some good end. If we can do that, that means that in a lot of situations, we won't get in our own way, right? So I'm thinking about, right, I teach college students on a regular basis, and sometimes they'll come to me because, they're struggling in the class, and in general, I mean, there are exceptions, but in general, it's not that they're struggling because it's the intellectual rigor is too great. In general, they're struggling because they keep getting in their own way, right? So they sit down and they say, today I will write the paper. And then they're turned aside by whatever rogue desires or some shiny thing that presents itself, like their phone is in their hand, right? And they're just turned aside, right? They can't stay in place towards some good end. So the ability to develop this virtue, and if you can do so in the context of sport, that helps us with self-governance, right? We're able to commit to things and see them through to completion. It's an important kind of freedom, and it helps us to flourish. When we think about what it means to be a good instance of our kind from the Christian vantage, there's a slightly different set of virtues. So this is because our greatest good on the Christian picture is beatific vision. So that's to see and know God. So we have virtues like honesty, kindness, patience, and so forth. And we still want those virtues, right? They help us to flourish as human beings, but there are other virtues that play a significant role in our relationship with God. Those are theological virtues. So faith, hope, and love. For example, hope is an appetite or desire for arduous goods. It involves continuing to desire and seek God and to live in light of God's promises, even when it's hard to do so. For Christians, our salvation is received. So I think the first night we heard about the received identity thing, right? It's given to you. Even so, Christians are called to participate in their sanctification. The Christian life is supposed to bear fruit or virtues. We're called to live lives that honor God. Or to use the image I provided earlier, our lives should testify or provide evidence of that great love. It should be clear when others see us that we love God. So virtues are something that we should actively work on. Okay, that is the virtue theory, you guys. I had to provide that background, and the reason is, one, if you know what virtues are for, then that motivates why you want them, right? So there's the kind of flourishing life, and there's the kind of God-honoring life, drawing closer to God, things like that. But also, if you want to use sports to develop virtues, then it's important that you figure out what a virtue is, right? It's a developmental question. If virtues are skills, right? Skills are developed in a different way than something like natural character, which is something you are born with, right? So you ask the question, what is it? And then how can I develop it? Okay, so now that we know what virtues are and that we want them, how do we develop virtue in sport in practical terms? Well, virtues are caught, they are sought, and they are taught. I'm going to talk about the teaching part, right? So using sports as a way of teaching athletes how to grow in virtue. And three strategies there are exemplars, practice, and reflection. So exemplars, I told you I'm a distance runner. There's a Kenyan runner in distance running who I greatly admire. His name is Eliud Kipchoge. Does anybody know who that is? You heard of? Yes. Okay. Eliud Kipchoge, September 17th, 2018, he broke the world record in the marathon. It was 2 hours, 1 minute, and 39 seconds, which is 4:38 pace per mile. If you're like me, you've never run a single mile that fast. If you're like me, then by comparison, Kipchoge runs like a cheetah and you run like a lion, a sea lion. Kipchoge has a stunning reputation for long-standing mastery of the sport, and for doing so, as far as we can tell, above reproach. He's the consummate exemplar for distance running. He's talented, humble, eloquent, affable, perseverant, and brave. I could learn a lot from him. But after Kipchoge's performance, my temptation was to be amazed, of course, but then to put him on a pedestal or set him aside as an outlier without ever bringing his achievement to bear on my own comparatively meager athleticism. Stated differently, what I was inclined to do was what Soren Kierkegaard calls mere admiration, when you appreciably perceive the excellence in another person and leave unchanged. Alternatively, I could be an imitator instead. So I could put on the good I observe in Kipchoge. I could become more perseverant, humble, or brave. And then I'm made better by my admiration of him. So this is the first means by which we can grow in virtue. We can surround ourselves with excellent people and emulate them. So exemplars are often excellent people like Kipchoge, and it doesn't mean that they have to be perfect, right? No one's perfect. It doesn't mean that we put them on a pedestal either, right? And align ourselves uncritically with their decisions. But exemplars illustrate certain virtues for us. And this matters because I can stand here and tell you that perseverance is a good thing to have, or patience, yeah, that's really nice. But until you see it, right, when you admire someone, you see those traits as imitably attractive, you recognize them as choice-worthy, and you're inclined to put on those virtues yourselves. So humans are imitative learners. So my first bit of advice is select exemplars, right, as a means of using sports to grow in virtue. Put them in front of you so you have that vision of excellence. Again, these people can be masters of the sport. They can be like Kipchoge. They can be like Michael Jordan or Simone Biles or whoever is the excellent person in your sport. Think about what makes them great and don't let your admiration of them remain inert as mere admiration. So imitate them, put on the excellences you observe. And second, this is important. The people you admire and take cues from don't have to be the strongest and the fastest person, right? So sometimes the most admirable people are those who occupy the sport with a high degree of integrity, train within their means, on balance with work or family or anything else they have going on in their lives. So maybe it's a member of a team who's a great encourager. Maybe it's someone who lives out their faith well in the sport. Someone I admire a great deal retrospectively is my dad. And it's not because he's a great distance runner, like he did fine. It was just that I have these memories as a child where my dad would wake up super early, like 5 a.m., and he would want to go do his run. And I remember as a child, I would try to catch him leaving and then ask if I could come along on my bike. And he would never act like I was begrudging him. He always just welcomed me into the task. And now that I'm a parent, I realized what a gift that was. Just that was his one block of the day that he was trying to sneak out and run. And I took it, and I joined. For coaches, I recommend raising up captains who demonstrate key virtues, so you could frame the sort of captain selection process in terms of character. And the reason to do that, there's empirical evidence that we are more inclined to imitate those who are relatable and attainable, right? So who's more relatable and attainable than a peer? Having that person there who is, to some extent, living above reproach and sort of raising the culture. I like to think of them as like buoys, like moral buoys that lift everyone else up. I also recommend that coaches and athletic administrators act as though they themselves are playing the role of exemplar. So whether or not you intend to be, your role is indistinguishable from the exemplar. So you need to model well-ordered loves. If what you pay attention to and praise is just performance, athletes will notice that. If you're a respecter of persons, in James's phrasing, extending dignity only to those athletes who are winning plays, athletes will notice that. So pay attention to what you praise in your own habits of attention. Your spiritual maturity matters. You wield a great deal of influence. Okay, the second strategy for developing virtue in sport is practice. The philosopher Aristotle, he's the father of virtue ethics. As a virtue ethicist, he is my dad. He writes that men become builders by building and lyre players by playing the lyre. So too we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts. So if you want to become more just, you do the just actions until they define you in a stable way. If you want to be more courageous, you need to rise to suitable risks again and again until it's a habit and you don't have to think about doing that. It takes the guesswork out of character development, right? So you say, oh, I'm not great in some respect. How do I get better? Well, you just get better. You just do the good thing again and again until you're better in that respect. So you have to do it to be it. You become more virtuous by doing the right thing. And this should sound familiar to people who love sports, right? Because it's not too different from what it looks like to grow in a certain respect as an athlete. So say you want to work up on layups or free throws, you drill it again and again. At first it's awkward, then eventually you know how to do it with a kind of ease and automaticity. That's what it's like to develop virtue. It takes practice. And sports can be helpful in that process. The reason is that sports, alongside music, is one of the few domains in which we apply the logic of practice. We perform intentional repetition to become better in a given respect, and it's relatively easy to invite virtue to be part of that process. So my advice to coaches is to take advantage of that practice by giving 2 prescriptions when you assign a workout. So you can give them the action sequence, and so that's whatever skill they're practicing or whatever workout they're undergoing, right? And then also a virtue objective, so what you're working on internally during that action. So practicing patience, courage, whichever suits the action sequence. So an example of this, in my own coaching, I would, during long runs, I would assign them, I would say, perseverance, what is that? It's remaining under a burden. And so sometimes I would come alongside the runners and I would say, I'm not asking you to do anything different. I'm just asking you to stay, right? Stay here in this, because that is the work of developing perseverance. It's being able to remain in place towards some good end. And I would prompt them to not become internally busy, right? Do you know what I mean? When you're doing one task, but your mind is somewhere else, right? That is a kind of practice that traces acedia, right? And that is the sort of vice of sloth, right? That kind of frenetic internal busyness. So internal work is a critical part of growing in perseverance. In fact, using physical work to grow in perseverance, it models the strategy employed by the Desert Fathers. Has anyone ever heard of the Desert Fathers? You know who the Desert Fathers are? Yay! Okay, awesome. So yeah, the Desert Fathers, Christian hermits, they're monks, Egypt, Mesopotamia from the 3rd to 7th centuries. If you want to take your character seriously, I highly recommend you read what the Desert Fathers said. I remember reading about this one monk. He was working on his temperance, and so he's working in the scriptorium, and he would hang a cucumber in front of his face, and it was a means of lessening his desires, right? I can't imagine having that response to a cucumber. You're like, oh my gosh, I can't stay away. But the point is, they are people who wanted lives of holiness, and they were willing to take it seriously like an athlete, right? Try these strategies and try to grow in certain respects. So the Desert Fathers, right, they were noticing that there were 2 temptations that monks had right around noon. They called it the noonday demon, right? And they experienced in their work either desperate escapism or despair, right? So the monks would either abandon ship and give up, right? Or they drifted away inwardly or outwardly toward something more comforting. They quit or became internally busy. So as a remedy, the monks performed stabilitas loci. This is a practice of staying in place during their work, right? So they would be doing manual labor and just being there, right? Not letting their minds flit away, not letting themselves give up, right? Just being in the work. And it's essentially perseverance, right? So training their physical frailty and fickleness of will to stay. And we did that in our training in cross country. We paid attention to where our minds went. We acknowledged the difficulty of perseverance, right? And perseverance is challenging not because of any obstacles that come your way. Thomas Aquinas actually calls that a separate virtue. It's constancy, right? Constancy is persisting despite obstacles. Perseverance's difficulty is internal to the task. Just the fact that it's really hard to stay in place towards some good end, right? That's the difficulty. You have to manage your desires, manage yourself through distractions and rogue emotions. And this is really hard to do in sport. Because in sport, your heart rate rises, right? And when your heart rate rises, your emotions shout at you instead of whisper. And so being able to stay in place when your heart rate's up, you're feeling agitated, and then being able to stay in place, it's the challenge level raises a bit. A second example is that when I assigned hill repeats to my cross-country team, I told them they were working on threshold, right? That's the physical objective. And there were pacing prompts based on the athlete's abilities. But I also gave them instructions in terms of the relevant virtue, and that was courage. So rising to suitable risks. And this was helpful because anytime you give someone a word, right, like the virtue term, it's like giving them spectacles, right, so they can better see themselves. It's also, I don't know if you have this experience, but in elementary school, when you're learning the grammar of different disciplines, like you learn a bunch of key vocab words in history or in math or something else, and then you see the world in terms of those words. That's what it is like to acquire a virtue vocabulary. You can see things in yourself that you didn't have words for previously, and you understand yourself better, morally speaking. Okay, I have two caveats about this process, right? This kind of practice of virtue in the context of sport. First, in the same way that you can't assign the same paces to all athletes, regardless of ability level, you can't give the same virtue prompt to all athletes either. So some of my runners were already reckless, right? They were willing to suffer even outsized pains or to run through injury, right? If they said something was painful, that would mean their leg was already broken, right? There's that kind of personality. For those athletes, I didn't want them to be more fearless, right? That would make them more reckless to their detriment. Instead, I set pacing limits and told them they could accelerate later in the run so they would learn what taking fitting risks feels like. Other runners would avoid risks entirely, and at the first sign of difficulty, they would cower, and so they ran too cautiously. For those runners, I needed to push them harder and help them to learn how to abide discomfort, so to condition them to experience fitting fear in the face of risks. I asked them to push a little harder and find comfort there, and if they pushed too far and imploded during practice, well, it's practice. That's what practice is for. And that way they could correct toward the mean. Aristotle provides a really helpful image of this. He talks about how humans are like warped boards, right? So if you've ever had like a piece of lumber and it has a bent in one direction, do you pull it further in that direction or do you pull it back in the opposite direction, right? You pull it in the opposite direction and then it corrects toward the mean. So if you're a little bit reckless, acting in terms of the coward slightly, right? It's pulling you back. If you're a little bit cowardly, pulling in terms of being a little more reckless, a little more daring. That's how you can develop the virtue. Yeah. Okay, second caveat about virtue development. Acquiring virtues can be awkward or slow, since virtues often run counter to your habits, right? The things that you've been developing, and also natural dispositions. So sometimes developing virtues, then you can have like a performance cost. The runner trying to be more courageous might get that wrong while they learn. A runner trying to be more patient might wait too long and miss a big move in the race, but this is progress if previously they were impetuous in races. Eventually you correct toward the mean and act in terms of the virtues. So for coaches, again, returning to the idea that it matters what you praise, You should notice virtue progress and praise that despite negative impacts on performance. Having the long view about development in virtue is really important in the same way that it is for developing physical skills. Okay, so far we said the developmental strategies are set up exemplars and really imitate them. Second, practice virtues, like really practice them the way that you do with physical skills. The third strategy is reflection. Reflection is valuable for a few reasons. First, as individuals, it matters because, as I described earlier, sometimes it helps to take stock of your days and think about what your lives are ordered toward, right? And there's not a lot of time for that, right? We live in a culture transfixed by screens, full of activities. It's hard to find the space to reflect and ask big humanizing questions about what we're doing and what it's all for. I find that some of my athletes and also students are on this sort of like achievement escalator to nowhere, right? And you ask, where are you going? Like, I don't know, right? And so taking the space to ask those questions is important. For Christians, also, you can incorporate prayer into that, right? Having the regular time to pray is important. When I coach, generally we would have a daily prayer, right, set our intentions, but we would have these moments, beginning of the season, and then a couple times partway through the season and at the end of the season, which was called note card time, and they would jot down, progress with respect to character or regress, right, and where they were, whether they were seeing any fruit in that respect. Team reflection is also important, especially if you communicate character goals to a team. It can be an opportunity for teams themselves to clarify their vision about what they're doing there so they can take ownership of it. And it's not just the coach prescribing these things without the kind of engagement of athletes. No one can develop a good character for you, and so you have to have buy-in from the athletes. Second, motivation matters in character. What's admirable about a good character is not just performing good actions, but also the assumed motivation supporting these good actions. Someone might persevere, but if they do it from a narcissistic place or for attention seeking, then the good action is about them. It's not about other people. It's not about honoring God. It's not a motivation that actually supports virtue. So having the time to reflect on the why of your actions is a really important part of virtue development. Okay, so those are the strategies, common mistakes. I'm briefly going to name 4. I mentioned this earlier, what coaches praise, what they pay attention to matters. So one way we often get character development wrong is we say we care about character and then we only talk about and celebrate success. Also, there are some times in which having a good character and success conflict. An example of this, during one of my first seasons of coaching cross country, our women's team was seeded to perform really well in the state championships. There was a chance that we could win. More likely, if we put together a solid day, we would probably end up on the podium. And part of the way through the race, it was looking like that was going to happen. But then one of the athletes from another team fell in the finishing chute, and my athlete came up alongside of her and helped her to her feet and assisted her down, walking her through to the finish, which, athletes were streaming by. It's fine. We could recover from something like that. However, in Texas, there's an anti-Good Samaritan rule in cross country. So it means like if you help someone, if you assist them, then that means you're disqualified. So our team was disqualified, and we didn't actually place at all that season. And in the moment, I was so kind of mad. Also kind of sad and disappointed, and you could see it on our athletes' faces, just kind of like confused about what had happened, right? And that moment for me was probably one of the most instructive moments, one about like where my heart actually was, but what I was conveying to the team. I had to use that moment and talk through the disappointment, but also say like, all season long, we had talked about how having a good character was the most important thing. And that was the moment where she did the thing of the good character, and it did come at the cost of performance, and just sitting with that sort of disjunction there, what is my real goal for this team? Is it really my goal too, right? Asking those hard questions of yourself. Okay, second way we get character development wrong, we misdefine virtues, right? So early 2000s, do y'all remember when people used to wear those shirts that said fearless on them? No? Okay. In middle school, if you were in middle school in the mid 2000s, there were shirts, they said fearless. Not a very good goal, right? Sometimes we define courage as fearlessness. And if you think about the athlete like rushing into battle without protection, fearlessness is not a good objective. It's not a social good. It's not going to be something that supports their own flourishing either. So yeah, what is the goal? The goal is to experience fitting fear in the right times, in the right ways, right? It's a lot easier to say fearlessness is the goal, but it's not actually a good goal. Okay, perseverance, right? Perseverance doesn't mean persisting toward every goal or every end. That's not a virtue. It's the vice of intransigence or bullheadedness. I like the word intransigence because it communicates this like unwillingness to turn. So an example of this is if you've ever read the book Into Thin Air, it's about climbers in Mount Everest, and a lot of the reasons why those climbers were successful in a lot of things was that they were willing to push past certain limits, right? They took certain risks. But you would see like the conditions change and things become unsafe, and they were still unwilling to relent, right? And it was their undoing, right? So a lot of lives were lost, something that would be a good-making feature in terms of reaching summits. You'd be more likely to reach them, and also more likely that you're imperiling your life and endangering people who have to come save you, right? So for perseverance, there are sometimes lines we shouldn't cross. So for example, if you could cause yourself great physical harm by pushing through injury, I know that culturally we celebrate people who finish marathons on broken legs, not actually an instance of good character or virtue. There are also moral lines we shouldn't cross, right? So in our sports, in terms of performance-enhancing drugs, right? That sort of thing, that's a moral line you shouldn't cross. Should you, wound the competition, right, in order to advance, like cheating behaviors like that, it's crossing a moral line. And there are cultural lines we shouldn't cross, right? So if you're all in on your sport and you do so even at the detriment of your relationships, people in your life who need you, then that's not an instance of perseverance. Perseverance is only good if it's toward good ends, right? So not all finish lines are good ones. Final example, joy. Joy is not a happy feeling, right? Sometimes people define it as such, but it's not hedonic. It's not a kind of subjective lift. What it is a kind of internal fixity on your purpose, right, regardless of circumstance. So how virtues are defined matters, right? It's about what you're looking for, what you're measuring. So that's really important. Third one, you moralize success. You praise as virtue what's not actually virtue. So sometimes we see progress in an athlete and we praise it as virtue. So one runner gets faster or stronger and you commend their discipline and perseverance. And sometimes that's a good proxy for measuring virtue, right? But one thing I realized through youth coaching is that there are other factors in play regarding progress, right? So, for example, the boys team throughout high school progressed largely in a linear fashion, right? And most of that, some of it could have been discipline, but a lot of it was just development, right? That kind of upward trend. Whereas the girls on our team, they would perform pretty well till some point in sophomore year, then they'd hit a performance nadir, and then maybe by the end of high school, they'd come out of it. And if you desist praising the female athlete in that time period, right, she could be working really hard, right? And so there are other things at play in terms of progress. And so when you're thinking about what you're measuring, what you're praising, make sure that it's like the habit, right, the process they're undergoing instead of just like the outcome. Okay, and then the last one, perhaps most common, you make character development a kind of window dressing that doesn't touch down on your lives, right? So you have words like integrity and discipline, post it on your gymnasium wall, but it doesn't touch down, or you name virtues in victory speeches that didn't actually, weren't actually developed, right? Things like that. And so making sure it's not insincere, making sure that it actually touches down. A rough comparison is like if you have a car that has a Jesus fish on it and you're just driving however you want, right? Like it's probably a worse reflection than just not saying anything at all. And so if you're going to have that intention and communicate that intention, it should have this kind of sincere bearing on things. So how can it go awry? You have character goals, but you only praise performance. You misdefine virtues in problematic ways. You moralize success or praise progress as virtue. And then the last one is just the insincere window dressing. So that's all that I have for you. And I'll take questions about any of that.